3, 2, di, 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 din, din, da, di, da, di, da, di, da, di, da, da. I da di 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 da di di I da di da di da di da di da di. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. We are here with the laws of breaking bread and our daily study. So important to have a daily Torah. Don't forget after 120 years, when we finish our lives, it says in the Talmud that what does God ask? It doesn't say, did you become the biggest Torah scholar in the world? Were you bigger than the Chazon Ish and Rav Chaim Kanievsky and Moshe Feinstein? No, it says in the Talmud that they're going to ask you, were you koveh eating the Torah? Did you establish set times for Torah study? And that is going to be to your merit. So that is what we're doing here with our daily study. And we are learning Lias Neshama Avimori Moshe Ben Chaim. And always, if you want to sponsor a class or you'd like to send in a refuah shlema, please be in touch with us. We're in chapter 41, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We're learning the laws of breaking bread and HaMotzi. We're on number 6. We learned yesterday that the custom is, just to remind ourselves, that we want to distribute, if we're cutting bread, again, it does happen that you cut up bread and distribute it when it's not Shabbos, and so we learned those laws. Most often, though, when you're making HaMotzi during the weekday, you're making your own HaMotzi because the bread we buy is already sliced, except on Shabbos. But it's not always the case. But on Shabbos, we said, just cut off big pieces for everybody. So it does, because of Tanug, Oneg, and Kavod of Shabbos. You want to enjoy Shabbos. You want to honor the Shabbos. Mitzvah lahavi ala shulchan melech. It's a mitzvah to put salt on the table. Koydem sheiptzat, before you break bread. Before you make HaMotzi, you should have salt on the table. V'yitbol prusas HaMotzi b'melech, should dip a piece of the HaMotzi bread, the bread that you made HaMotzi on, into the salt. Because the salt is like, the table is like an altar, the altar in the base of Migdash. We speak about that in number 44, a little bit later.
That's even during like the high holidays too. When
this is every day. Every day it's a mitzvah. Every day.
Yeah.
Shabbos, Yom Tov, except Yom Kippur.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we can leave it there.
Right, the meal before Yom Kippur.
Yeah, or we can leave it. We can leave it on the table.
Yeah, you could leave it on the table, absolutely. But we'll get to that, because it's a question like, do you have to dip, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just about because the table, our Shabbos, or the table, or the Shabbos table is like an altar in the temple. There's a reason behind it, right? It's because Hachila Korban, because the food around the table is like eating from a sacrifice in the altar. V'nemar, as it says in V'ikra, al kol karbecha tzachik melech. On every single offering, we put salt. Because our tables are like a mizbeach, like the altar in the base of Migdash. Tovli zaher, it's good to take proper care. Shelo laharog alav kina. You should not kill any lice on your table. And I would guess that would go for an ant too. Let's look a little bit more into some of these ideas here. First, the Kabbalah, according to the Mishnah Berurah and others, say that you should dip it 3 times in the bread. Now, you notice sometimes people toss salt on the bread. I'm not going to say that they're like, it's not a bad thing to do. But our sources and our customs say to dip the bread into the salt 3 times. The Kitzur explains that just like sacrifice offered on the altar would atone for the sins of the Jewish people, so to our table atones for sins, because it's a place where we host guests. The Mishnah Berurah discusses this too, right? In other words, the table is a place where we bring in the divine presence. It's connected to the korbanos. It's a time of rectification of our midos. It's a time of improving ourselves. We can't bring the korbanot, but we definitely can have guests over. The Mishnah Berurah writes that the table atones for one's sins, as it were, since they give bread to poor people, whether they're poor in spirit or poor in other ways. The Shar Tzion explains that the table has the power of atonement when you recite Torah around it. In other words, if you're just talking about sports and TV shows, so maybe your table is not doing the work of atonement. But if you say some Torah around the table, even one idea, that's how it works. So these three ideas together are beautiful, right? Is that we have people who are in need around our table, that we speak Torah around our table, and that we do hachnasas orchim. All those things are all big mitzvahs. So those mitzvot that we do around the table, they atone, they bring a repair, right? That's what I really want. I want to call it a tikkun. It's a repair for those things that we've messed up on or that we could be doing better. Now the other thing is that when we eat and a proper kavana, we've talked about this. Proper kavana in eating is not to eat just again on a regular day, just because we have a deep taiva desire. We also should remember, ideally, should always remember that we need to strengthen ourselves. That we're eating so we can be healthy to serve God, right? That our food is a form of this. Now, I just heard a very fascinating discussion yesterday. Nebuch lo aleinu, refuah shlema to all those who are suffering from this. That those who have eating disorders, have a really different. It's a mental illness, right? It's a rampant in our society, and I have no idea if this is any kind of preventative measure, but if our eating is if we put kavana into our eating, that we're eating so that we can be healthy and serving God, and we explain that to our children, perhaps that will be some kind of prophylactic effort to help, people avoid falling into it. It's a big machla. May they all have a refuah shlema. Now, killing allows. Now, people don't see lice on the table very often, but you might see other things. And the idea being this, that the table is a place of respect, and we don't want to do anything, disgusting or gross at the table. So the example that he gives is killing a louse, but I think that would apply to anything else disgusting. Number 7, im machlek perusa HaMotzi lemasubim. If you're distributing pieces of bread upon which for other people to say HaMotzi on, lo yizerkan, you shouldn't throw them. Now, of course, we all know that the Sephardim do throw bread. So, but the idea here is that the asr lizrok, you're not supposed to throw bread because it's considered a lack of respect. But if you're accustomed to throw bread, obviously, then that's different. You shouldn't put it directly into somebody's hand. So whether you're giving them bread to make hamotzi on, or you made the hamotzi and you're handing out the bread, should always put it on a plate to pass around or put it on the table in front of people. You shouldn't put it directly into their hands. You should put it down before them. It's proper. Why do you avoid placing the bread into the person's hand? Because this is something which is done. It's a custom for a mourner to put bread into the hand of a mourner, and we don't want to, God forbid, do anything like that when a person's not mourning. Mitzvah livtsoya, it's a mitzvah to break the bread, i.e., to make the bracha al hapas hachashuv yoser, upon the bread which is more important. V'lachein im yesh lefanav chaticha pas. If you have one cut piece of bread, upas shalem, and you have one whole piece of bread in front of you, in other words, you have a loaf of bread and a part of a bread, and you have in mind to eat from both of these things during the meal, and they're both the same kind of grain, right? They're both wheat bread. Then the halacha is that even the whole bread, even if is smaller, even if it's like a challah roll, and then a half of a loaf of a big bread, yivsa shalom, you should cut on the whole bread, make the bracha on the whole bread, do chashav yoser, because a whole bread, even a smaller bread, is considered more important. That's how we understand these things, that it's a more important bread because it's whole. A couple of notes here of significance. First, that the sif later in the next, we'll probably get to it when we get to it. Today almost all the bread that most people eat is from wheat, but it's the type of grain that it's made out of has an impact on the halacha here, insofar as that certain grains and certain breads have a little bit more importance because of what they're made out of. So we have to understand the grain that they're made out of, whether it's a loaf of bread is whole or broken, and the quality of the flour from which the bread is made, and then the size of the bread. It's a lot of ideas here. Let's go through them again. What's the bread made out of? What type of flour? So is it wheat, or maybe it was made out of another kind of grain? Is it a whole or a half or part or a piece? What's the quality of the flour? And lastly, the size of the bread. Those are issues to keep in mind. Should ideally have this in mind before you say the HaMotzi bracha, right? So you don't have to pause and go, oh, where's my Kitzur Shulchan Aruch? I got to look this up. Now, the above we listed the 5 types of grain, and some are more significant than others. Like I said, what does it mean the fineness? Well, that's really having to do with the whether it's like a coarse bread, a coarse flour or not. So how much it's ground. And I'm guessing that the more it was ground, the more expensive it is, the nicer it is. We'll talk about whole wheat bread when the time comes. I love whole wheat bread. Let's say you've got 2 breads in front of you that are from different types of grain. The whole bread is from an inferior, type of bread. Kagon, shashalem hu pas kusmin. It was spelt bread. V'chaticha hu pas chitin, and the piece that's whole, a partial piece, is made out of wheat. Afilu ktana. Even if the cup piece is small, mevarach al chitim, you should always bless on the wheat bread first, because even if it's smaller, because wheat and barley, which are mentioned in the Torah as one of the 2 species of the 7 holy species from the land of Israel, they're the most important. They're the most important grains, and Eretz Yisrael was blessed with these, and through these. And 3 other species of grain are considered inferior. So the halacha is teaching that the species of grain is the predominant consideration in the precedence of the bread. That's the first thing. What's it made out of? So one who has bread of any other, let's see, you've got spelt bread. By the way, rye bread today is not all rye. Just putting it out there. I love rye bread, but the rye bread that we have is a mixture of rye and wheat. So we're talking about a whole spelt bread, or an all rye bread, or an oat bread. Those are all, or anything else, those are all inferior to wheat or barley. And so you're going to always say HaMotzi on the wheat or barley piece or whole, obviously whole, before you say one on the spelt rye, oat breads. Let's say it was from barley. Now we know that barley is one of the 7 species. And of course, barley is very important for making beer, but that's a whole nother class. Even though barley bread is not as good as wheat bread, as we all know. Mikol Makam, nonetheless, since barley is mentioned specifically in the Torah as one of these important grains, of one of these important species of Eretz Yisrael, that you want to look it up, it's in Devarim, Deuteronomy 8, chapter 8, verse 8. V'gam hu shalema, and it's also a whole, if you've got a whole barley bread. Lachein Yerushalayim yesh lecha lekavo, you should show respect, a God-fearing person, gam l'zeh shonim shalom, to the whole loaf of barley bread. And how do you do it? In other words, we're probably supposed to say HaMotzi over the wheat first. Wheat's mentioned first. It's a nicer flour. Okay, so what do? You're going to just ignore the barley bread? God forbid, we shouldn't have ignored the barley bread. What are we going to do with the barley bread? Maniach et hachatira tachat shlema. You should place the cut piece under the whole piece, and hold them together when you say the HaMotzi. And then the Bir Gra explains, in other words, you make HaMotzi, really you're making HaMotzi on both of them. You take a piece from both of them. Now, in the verse that mentioned the species from the land of Israel, wheat is mentioned before barley. So all being equal, as I mentioned, wheat's going to take precedence. But the barley bread in this case is whole. Again, this is hypothetical, right? You got a whole barley bread and a part wheat bread, which is cut. So that's why we have this little situation on our hands, right? We got the whole barley bread and the part wheat bread. But again, this is hypothetical because it's very hard to find barley bread. Okay. That's you've got two rolls of bread. Or two pieces that are cut. And they're from the same kind of species of grain. Yavarach ala naki yoter, should write the blessing on the one made with nicer flour. Vim shteim shavos bekinu. This is an equally nice flour. Yavarach al yoser gadol, make it on the larger one. Now, to summarize, one must first consider what's the bread made of. If it's made of wheat or barley, it's going to take precedence over different species of breads. If the two breads are made from the same type of grain, should make on the bread that's whole. If they're both whole or both broken, recite on the one made of finer flour. If they're made from the same flour, the same everything, make it on the bigger bread. If they're both equal in that respect as well, you should write blessing on the larger one. This comes up all the time on Shabbos, right? This is not the kind of thing you bump into on a Wednesday very often. So, God forbid, I wouldn't want anybody to instruct if they're at somebody else's house. I wouldn't want them to, start giving out orders about what to do, because you're going to see a lot of people do all kinds of things on Shabbos, and we don't want to improve. We're just going to work on our own performance of the mitzvah of having a meal, and we're going to do it to the best of our ability. And if somebody asks us why we do the way we do it, you can say, "Oh, because I go to daily Torah study. I'm serious about this Judaism. Not that you're not, but I take this stuff very seriously." Joking aside, a lot of people do make mistakes here, and even people who've learned it make mistakes because it's complex. So it's good we're reviewing these things so that we get it right. Okay, we're going to wrap up the chapter now with a couple of small, important points. Number 9, yesh im yesh lefanav. You have two breads before them. Pas Yisrael, pas akbam. You have one that's pas Yisrael, one that's from, from BB's Bakery, and one is from somewhere else, from Whole Foods, but they're both kosher. Right? And he doesn't avoid bread made by non-Jews. In other words, it's kosher, it's just not pas Yisrael. Then what's the halacha? Im shtem shlemos, if they're both whole breads, or shtem prusas, or they're both cut pieces. V'gam Shabbos, they're the same size. Ben minachad, the same type of grain, right? Yivarach ala pas Yisrael. You make bracha on the bibi's bread, the pas Yisrael bread. Vim Israel. But let's say the bread baked by the kosher bakery, Einu Naki Kmosha Akum, right? You bought it from a different bakery, not as good as Bibi's, right? Or in Detroit, Siemens, or in the Valley, Continental, right? You got it somewhere else. So it's not quite as good as the bread from the non Pas Yisrael bread. Yivarach al Ezesha. You can make a bracha on either one. You don't have to make it on the Pas Yisrael bread. If the other bread is nicer, you can use it. Let's say the host avoids bread made by, again, it's not Pas Yisrael bread, it's kosher, but it's not non-Jewish bread. The bread baked by the non-Jewish person was brought to the table for a guest who does not eat such bread. Proper with the bread. So now you've got a situation on your hands. Again, this rare case, but let's say you've got you're at somebody's home and they only eat Pas Yisrael, and somebody brought some bread, like a Trader Joe's challah, right? Beautiful challah. I'm sure it's good, kosher, but it's not Pas Yisrael. And you didn't have time to, put it in the oven and bake it some more. And it's Shabbos. So he says you should take it off the table when you say HaMotzi. And that's when the host is saying the bracha on behalf of everybody. The bread that's not Pas Yisrael should be removed from the table. The Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah discuss these things. However, it's not so clear because really a lot of people have a custom to say their own HaMotzi. Okay, and where it is the custom that a lot of people say their own HaMotzi, the host should recite the blessing on the Pas Yisrael bread, and the guests can recite it on the bread that they brought. So, but if there's one HaMotzi for everybody, that would be the custom, take it off. But again, if it would offend somebody or something, we don't want to, God forbid, cause a big fight. But you understand that the bread that's Pas Yisrael does have a higher level of importance. Number 10. Kol din kadimas chashuva, all the halachas regarding this whole thing about which bread to eat from. It only counts if you're going to have in mind to eat from them during the meal. If you only plan on cutting into one of these breads and eating from one of these breads during the meal, make HaMotzi on the one you're going to want to eat and use that one. We don't take into account the differences in the breads or the more importance of the breads in that case. So the Mishnah Berurah adds on here. So if you want to eat from one bread, you don't want to eat from the other bread, but you need you have two breads there because it's, let's say, Shabbos, you want to have two lechem mishnah. You say the bracha on the one you want to eat, even though they're both on the table. However, if you have no preference, recite the blessing and eat the one that's more significant. So this comes up a lot on Shabbos. You want to have two breads, but you don't want to, let's say, cut into the big bread for whatever reason. You want to save it for the next meal, so forth and so forth. If you have in mind to only eat from one of the breads, make HaMotzi on that one. But if you have in mind to have from both the breads, then all the things that we discussed in the last few things are important to keep in mind. And with that, we finished the laws of breaking bread.